For those of you who have joined, we're just waiting a couple of minutes as the participants come to the webinar. So we'll get started in a minute or two. Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stefan Leslie. I'm the CEO of Research Nova Scotia, and this is the webinar to explain the focused research investments, which we just released yesterday, and in particular to focus on the expression of interest section, which just opened again just yesterday. So we've got about 80 people on the call. It is being recorded, so everyone is aware. Excuse me. And it will be posted on the website if there are colleagues who wish to see it at a later time. So I'll just get going. So just make sure you're on the right webinar. We are talking about FRIs, Focused Research Investments, with the deadline of the EOI at the end of April. So that's in about 2 months' time. We anticipate for those EOIs that are selected to go forward to full proposal to have the full proposal due at the end of July, but that will be confirmed. Individual FRIs of between 5 and 20 million awards each for a duration of 5 to 7 years. And we have a budget secured at this point of 25 million, which will enable us to support up to 3 FRI with the intention of announcing the results publicly in April of this year, so April 2024. So in very brief summary, what we are looking to achieve with focused research investments is to achieve significant results for this province through the research activity. So these are big, they're focused, they're intentional, deliberate, and I'll get into much more detail about what that means. We anticipate as an organization providing support to the FRIs themselves, not just, of course, as a funder, but as they proceed through their 5 to 7 year time frame to provide institutional level support, provide connection to perhaps other funders, organizations like MyTax or AceNet for high performance computing and various other things to set them up for success. And we intend to provide significant flexibility around how those funds are used. So as long as we have our organization an agreement around how those funds are to be deployed in service of what outcome, then we can provide significant flexibility around the use of the funds, significant flexibility around what structure best can deliver on the outcomes and achieve the impact that we're hoping to see. And indeed, lots of flexibility in what areas to propose. And so we have not come in here identifying here the 3 subject matter areas or 10. We have described a model of how this can work, and we are openly inviting the research community in collaboration with end users to come forward and propose how they can deploy that kind of system in service of achieving those outcomes. So the agenda for this morning, after that initial initial couple of slides, is I'm going to speak, and this will be the biggest component around the EOI requirement. So this is the detail around what we mean and what we're looking for in the expression of interest. To make it clear on how that might work, we're going to provide an example. This came up a lot in the consultation phase of the past 6 to 8 weeks. People want to kind of see what we meant. And then I'll take you on a bit of a tour around how to find additional information and updates over and above what you'll see here and can read in the EOI document itself. So I'm going to start with the EOI requirements. So the first thing to know is, if you haven't already come across it, if you visit our website to the FRI page, all of the information we have around and everything that'll be presented today is found here. Although this webinar amplifies certain elements to provide greater kind of context or meaning for what some of those elements mean. But if you go to that website and you click on the expression of interest button there, then that will take you to a page that includes a button that says download application guidelines. And much of what I'm going to be saying over the next probably 20 minutes or so of the webinar will be drawn from what are in those guidelines. So those guidelines start with a set of definitions. Now, this is just four. This is a screen grab from the PDF that's on the website. These are just four definitions. There's about 15 or 16 of them in total. And we've decided to provide clarity around how these terms can be used. There's lots of different ways or definitions that people use things like goals and outcomes and objectives and all strategic objectives and all those sorts of things. So to simplify things and to try and align the nomenclature that the different EOIs use, we're trying to kind of structure that so that there's consistency in the language to facilitate the ultimately what needs to happen, which is the determination of the EOIs to go forward. So I encourage you to have a look at those definitions. And if they're not clear, or if there is ambiguity, as with just about anything in what I'm presenting today and in the EOI, there is a mechanism for you to seek clarity around that and for us to provide additional information or corrections if required. We then spend the next part of the EOI guidance. It has two sections around understanding the opportunity and some context of the mandate of Research Nova Scotia, which is where I'm going to spend just one slide. And I know some of you on this call will have seen this before. I've used this quite a lot in the consultation phase, but I thought it was worth reflecting on where FRI came from, because this should drive the kinds of research proposals that are generated by it, at least in some way, shape, or form. And to go back now 8 years to the speech from the throne in the provincial legislature, the idea, which then later became Research Nova Scotia, had from the outset this notion that we were to support research projects in areas of particular importance to the province. So from the beginning, our mandate was to identify those areas that this province needed research to serve. And then 2 years later, when the corporation was actually set up along with its funding regulations, the language had actually evolved even a little bit further beyond that. And instead of just being limited to areas of particular importance, there was this phrase of research that produces opportunities and outcomes. I'll return to that phrase in a slide or two forward, but it is the sense that research, not just in key areas, but that is mobilized to produce outcomes and produce opportunities for society. And so then when Research Nova Scotia developed our mission-oriented strategy, which was put on the website in 2020, that's why some of the language speaks to solving big challenges in the province. It's the natural outcome for the funding regulations that we had from 2018. Then 2 years ago in 2022, about 18 months ago, actually, we released our most substantial 3-year operating and strategy implementation plan. And in that plan, we talked about focused research efforts. And really, this is about, there are big problems and they require a big solution or big effort. We support lots of projects and equipment and people doing various different things, but for certain of those large challenges, we need to devote more significant resources, and that is what has brought us here today to release focused research investments. So I want to just return to this idea of research that produces opportunities and outcomes, because it does beg the question of, if we haven't got the outcome we're looking for in society, what is going to achieve it, or what will pursue that outcome? And I've obviously spoiled the ending, because we are looking for research that produces those opportunities and outcomes. And this is where the act of discovery is to increase the knowledge we have in a certain field or a certain area, is a critical piece to moving towards that outcome in society. But it's not always research that is that limiting factor. There are often policy impediments or policy choices that need to be made that is actually preventing the achievement of that outcome. So there's lots of work that can benefit from research, but if really the issue is around policy development or how competing objectives in the policy sphere operate, then additional research, although it may be informative, may not be the key element that will actually result in achieving the outcome. And equally, there can be gaps in execution where there's simply not enough money to do something, or there's just not enough people that can be devoted to it, because we are making certain choices on the use of time, funding, and effort and so on every day in society, but how much we're going to devote to the various competing policy objectives we have. And so we're very much looking for those issues where research and the supply of the elements that research produces can mobilize society towards that outcome. And so if you think about just 3 examples within climate, healthcare, and economic development, within those 3 broad areas, you can think of components where genuinely research would help advance the delivery of healthcare, but perhaps other areas of healthcare, it's not so much research, but a policy and or execution matter. And so the first element to kind of have in mind is when you're considering where you might want to take your proposal, it's really to hone in on and think through what is going to maximize the chance of the pursuit and achievement of that outcome in society, and find those connections to where the research that you actually have some control over can be that contributing factor. So then there's a section on purpose and guidance, and there's really 3 major elements to that, which will be themes that come up throughout the rest of this hour or hour and a half that we have in this webinar, and you'll see repeatedly in the application guidelines is this focus on outcome and the delivery of public benefits. In order to do so, the requirement to engage end users in the appropriate way and at the appropriate times through the process. The time frame, as I mentioned at the outset, is 5 to 7 years. And so we are looking for efforts that will generate or have the prospect of generating those outcomes within that time frame, so we can show progress against those sorts of important matters. But at the same time, we want to build the capitals that we have, or the capital that we have in this province, the physical and intellectual capacity to solve problems in the future. So we are looking at this as truly an investment, not just to generate the outcomes as described in 1, but to set us up for ongoing achievement or pursuit of other activities that may build on that in the outer years. And then we are looking at a collaborative and coordinated approach in pursuit of those outcomes. So outcomes in order to achieve them will likely require the integration of multiple projects. But then there's also this notion of complementary efforts, and that is where the work that is within the FRI may in fact complement other research or commercial or other sorts of activities which build on the investment that's made in the FRI, but can also support other activities that are going on. So I'll get into some more detail on this in a little bit. You will note in the guidelines 3 things that this is not. It is not a training program, although of course we are seeing training as an incidental benefit. It is not in and of itself designed to train additional researchers of the next generation or HQP. It is not to produce general capacity to do work or platform technologies or various other things. There are other programs for that. Whether or not they're done well or sufficiently funded is a separate question. But FRIs are not about general capacity, nor is it about knowledge mobilization in and of itself, which may seem ill at ease with something that's focused on outcomes. But as we'll go through in the coming slides, the pursuit of those outcomes is in the way the projects are designed and the engagement of the end users with that view to the uptake at the end. It's that focusing on the demand side and then building a research program in order to fit it as a mechanism of producing those outcomes outside of what might more traditionally be seen as knowledge mobilization activities. I'm going to turn now to a section in the paper that's called Characteristics of FRI Research. And I'm going to start with the Frascati manual, it's now in its 7th edition from the 1960s, was the first edition, and they're updating it again for the 8th edition. But they use, the OECD manual uses 5 different aspects or characteristics of research. The first is that it is activity that is novel. It is aimed at new findings. It is creative based on original concepts and hypothesis. There's a degree of uncertainty, and I'm going to highlight this one in the third one here, and the 5th one in particular with respect to FRIs, because when I say uncertain and the achievement of the final outcome is that research cannot necessarily be held to account to achieve that outcome if it is an outcome as defined in society. What we can hold ourselves to account to in the research side is developing a research set or a set of research activities, a research system that is designed to fit into an approach that will pursue those outcomes. But this is not a kind of contractual arrangement or commissioned research where the work is done to fit a particular client's needs. This is still the pursuit of research in that discovery mode. It is systematic, it's planned and budgeted in the context of the rest of these elements. What we mean here is that systematically the choices made within the research program is devoted in service of achieving the ultimate objectives to pursue that outcome of the FRI itself. And then 5th, this idea of transferability or reproducibility. And this isn't just around being able to reveal methodology and data sets so that results can be reproduced by another researcher. It's this idea that we are looking for activities that pursue an outcome, yes, but we want to see that knowledge available to be applied in different areas or contexts. So if you want to think about it this way, it is not just repeatable in the sense of you can apply the methodology and get the same results, but that it can be applied outside the context of its immediate production and by those who are immediately involved in that production, and therefore can be relied upon in a broad variety of other endeavors. That's part of the investment idea, that we are building things that have a flow-on effect or a positive reinforcement and application in other areas. So those are the sorts of efforts that we're looking to support here. The second aspect of this I want to speak to is around the different elements of what is driving research. And Melissa Flagg came up with this binary approach of identifying research done for prestige, which she associated largely with much academic research, where it is really about pursuing areas of interest based on curiosity or of largely intrinsic value. And of course, use can eventuate, but that's not what's driving it. And this is not designed or this is not intended to be used in a pejorative sense. Prestige is a really important marker of quality, and it is what also provides the foundation of lots of other knowledge generation activities that can produce other values to society. But nevertheless, that's part of the research system that isn't part of the FRI, but nor at the other extreme, what Melissa Flagg called profit, I've broadened here to call production, because profit is fine when you're talking about industry, but really what we're talking about here is this research that is much more fit for purpose to fill an immediate need. This is the application of all the different scientific tools and techniques in order to resolve a very specific problem. And some of those example organizations at the bottom would be those sorts of organizations that typically be involved in this. So, government research organizations or the IRAP program, they are pursuing research to fulfill an immediate need. Maybe if it's on the industry side, it's to develop a new product or to pursue a new market. If it's a government organization, it's to deliver on a public policy or delivery of government services. And what we're really talking about here is reliable products that do the labeled job for the labeled purpose, which is what we need in society. In fact, we need more of it. This is the kind of evidence we want to see go into better decision-making and better delivery of services, whether they're government delivered or otherwise. But nevertheless, that's not what we're talking here, because what we're talking about here is what we call the public agenda, which sits between prestige and production. And at its kind of perhaps simplest form, it's simply listing the priorities. And if Research Nova Scotia as an organization had been set up as described in that original speech from the throne, where a set of priorities are established and then research in those areas was what we were here to do, then we would be firmly in that area where we would be working on broader policy areas or investigation areas that were of priority to society, however defined. But moving into a more kind of directed sense, the next sort of set over would be where those outcomes are defined, but there's considerable flexibility around the pathways to actually achieve that. So if you are familiar with the Research Nova Scotia strategy, you will see, and I'll present on the next slide, where our outcomes are. But then the door has always been very broadly open to invite the community to say, here is what we want to achieve. There's multiple ways to get there. Please come forward with ideas on how you can devote research in service of achieving those outcomes. But at the most kind of or closest to production, but yet still within the public sphere, is where we've both identified the outcomes, but also those pathways. And identifying those pathways is a collaborative model. This is not a funder certainly imposing what those pathways are. That would put it into the production. But this is the kind of the dialogue that we need to have so that we understand not just what outcomes we're going to achieve, but we have confidence that the elements of the research that then follows is being developed to serve those particular outcomes. And so that, I think, best serves this idea of, sure, research, but it is to achieve a broad variety of endeavors. And Research Nova Scotia generally as an organization fits within those two particular columns, mission-oriented to mission-directed, with FRI sitting very much under that mission-directed column. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, we do have an outcomes framework that's been in our strategy now for a number of years, and you'll see 16 boxes there arranged under 4 different columns, which organizes how these missions kind of are situated in society. And a way to think about this, if we're just to kind of strip away and focus on healthy people and healthcare systems as an example, then what FRI is attempting to do is to say we are inviting the research community to respond, and in this particular example, to say there is an idea that if we had secure funding of that level over that number of years, we think we can really move the needle on this piece around disease detection for this particular vulnerable population. And so the idea is that you extract from that or derive from that broad set of outcomes to say, here are, and I've put 3, but there could be 1, there could be 5, a number of more specific outcomes of what we mean by advancing disease detection for what vulnerable populations. And then once done, that will then drive out a series of research activities which are integrated in that they are devoted in service of achieving those outcomes that have been defined by that societal need as described in that column under our strategy. So that at sort of at a broad conceptual level, that's how this all works. So basis of selection, Not surprisingly, where I have them in red, so there's a number of them here, 5 or 6 of them. Where they are in red are the ones that are of particular emphasis at the EOI stage. All of them will be assessed by the end of the process, but we're starting at the EOI with 3 of them. And the first, of course, or perhaps not surprisingly, is we want to know in considerable detail what outcomes you are proposing to pursue. Can you define them? Do you know how to reach them? Have you got a convincing pathway to achieve those? Not surprisingly, that it is research that drives the contribution to the solution, hearkening back to the slide I spoke to a couple of minutes ago. That there is this evidence of significant coordination and integration with the research team, and that could be across different disciplines, the relevant sectors, including end users. There's this idea of broad societal value from the outputs and applicable in a variety of different ways, and that there's a degree of relevance and urgency for Nova Scotia. As you can well imagine, funds are tight these days for lots of different organizations, and we have to choose we have to make our selections wisely. And so it behooves us to identify those sorts of issues that have those outcomes, where research is a feature, where we can put in the window that we are finding ways to mobilize the research community on areas that are important, relevant, and urgent to the province. And then finally, there will be an assessment of capacity to deliver. The first 5 are all well and good, but we need to make sure, of course, that the research team itself and the host organization or organizations that are involved have the capacity to deliver. So eligibility, that kind of has 2 different dimensions. First of all, we are talking about a FRI that may be time limited or ongoing. And when I say time limited, I mean the organization on the FRI may come together for the 5 to 7 year as kind of an organizational structure. And then once complete, would then fold into something else or be subdivided into ongoing activities or end, because it really does have a natural endpoint. We are interested in your ideas on things that could fit that model, or indeed have an ongoing life. But again, within that time frame of 5 to 7 years, this idea of what the next logical step to build would be in an ongoing phase. It can be an existing organization. Many of you, of course, already are associated with a current organization that could take this on. It could be a brand new organization, or it could be spun out from something. Again, we are open to whatever makes most sense to deliver on those outcomes. And it can be embedded within an existing organization or established as a standalone group, consortium, or organization. So now the eligibility around the host. So it does need to be a legal entity. As an organization which provides the funding, we will enter into a kind of essentially a contractual arrangement where we will provide the grant of funds according to a payment schedule. And so the entity is the organization with whom we would have that relationship. And they need to have the ability to engage in a number of different elements, including the management of the resources within the grant that we provide, decision-making around it, and so on, but also be able to receive and administer those funds. These are public resources, and so we have to deal with an organization that has that degree of professionalism and oversight, and has the ability to report on those activities, and not just maintain an accountability structure in a kind of a financial or strictly financial sense. It is this idea of developing and continuing to further this idea of how the organization will hold itself to account to pursue that outcome, which may result in adjustments and tweaking throughout the period of its existence, because we want to see everything devoted in service of the achievement of the ultimate outcome. And that's part of the accountability framework of looking at the right indicators and keeping on watch. Needs to not just be interested in, but have a particular talent or desire to find ways to effectively collaborate with partners as required. And equally, to work with the uptake organizations and the users of the research. They are, in the end, the intended beneficiaries of the effort. And so understanding with whom you need to speak and when and about what and why is part of what it takes to be an organization that's capable of embarking on this kind of work. The next part of the application guidelines and the application process has 4 paragraphs. This is, again, a screen grab from that PDF. And so there's 4 components to it. So we have established an external advisory panel, and there is, I'll take you to the spot on the website in a moment, that will provide insight and advice on the selection at both the EOI and the full proposal stage. In the adjudication process, it may well be that we would find it helpful to request additional information or clarification, either from all applicants if we find that there's something that we need to feed into the system that isn't available, that we didn't think to ask in the application phase, that we want to go back out and clarify, or on individual applications, we may go back and seek additional information once it's submitted to provide supplementary information to help make sure we understand what is being proposed so that we make the best choice possible. And then in the development of the EOI to the full proposal, so this would be from sort of May to July, those 3 months, that once we've selected an EOI or EOIs to go forward into the full proposal, at that point, we have made the assessment that those EOIs have every chance of developing themselves into a full, comprehensive, fully elaborated, high-quality proposal. And we see part of our role as helping ensure that those are developed to their highest possible potential. How exactly that's going to work, we will kind of sort out in the coming months. What resources are required and how they'll be used by each team, of course, will vary depending on what those teams need. My point in bringing it up here is in just saying that, in particular, in a process which has very tight timelines, we want to provide that kind of institutional support to maximize the chance of fantastic development of proposals from those EOI stages. The EOI stage, pardon me. You will also note that in the EOI evaluation component, there is not an assessment of scientific rigor or scientific quality. Everything that Research Nova Scotia can fund by matter of policy, without exception, has to meet the high scientific standards. That assessment will happen at the full proposal stage, and it will be done by an independent person or persons or group that have the competency to assess the standards of that particular discipline, so that we make sure that we are able to maintain the highest possible scientific standard. And it is, and the reason it says it's a condition of funding is it is not the objective to pursue research excellence in that way. It is a condition. The objective is to achieve the outcome for society, and the only work that we will fund that can pursue that is ones that meet the condition of high research standards. Now, in the JURA application sections of the document, we are asking for the name, the applicant's name, and the host. Those are all pretty straightforward. And then we've framed questions around, or thinking around, a single question of to what end, which is perhaps deceptively simple, but it's meant in 3 different aspects. It is to what end in the sense of purpose. Anyone who's written a purpose statement to apply for grad school would be familiar with kind of what this is about. This is what it is, why this is, why you are proposing to take this on. What is the purpose of the proposed FRI? But also, to what end is, the end is terminus. At the conclusion of the work, what is that outcome and the impact? At the end point, what is the achievement or value that is anticipated? And then the final aspect of the question, to what end, is what is its priority and the need? And that has a couple of different dimensions, because this asks you or the applicant to look outside the strict boundaries of what's being proposed in the quality of the particular outcome or the desirability of the outcome, but where that may sit in the context of all the other challenges, risks, and opportunities that exist, perhaps within your field, but also more broadly in society. And it has the important dimension as well of why this ought to be of interest or importance at the provincial level. So this is kind of an important area in distinguishing between how a province needs to use its scarce resources. It is going to need those resources in service of things that exist at or are driven by or needed by that provincial level. We, of course, are contributing to more local, national, and global or international scale, but there needs to be that connection to why is that being proposed to be done here? There needs to be a reason of why it makes sense to do this here. And that's where some of that kind of thinking and exploration can occur in that third different aspect. So this is very much a narrative approach. We have given quite simple requests for information and then given you a word count that allows you to explore these three different areas. There is commentary that you can make that could fit perhaps in a couple of different ones, and we're leaving it open for you to explore what this means to you, as long as you keep in mind these three different dimensions of the question: to what end? Then there's this idea of pathway to impact, which I'm going to speak to in just a moment, but this is this idea of understanding what are the different important components within the proposed FRI that will maximize the chance of actually realizing the outcome either along the way or at terminus, at the outcome phase. We are, of course, asking for who's the primary applicant, but also who is the team, what partners you may have, and we're asking for different kind of levels of commitment, or to the extent to which you have got them engaged or had preliminary conversations, and with whom you wish to collaborate. And all those different terms, from purpose and outcome and impact and collaborators, those are all in the definition section as well. And of course, we need some idea of your both total budget and the requested Research Nova Scotia budget from Research Nova Scotia. You'll see in the document that there is no mandatory or required matching or partner funds. But that said, of course, there are FRI which will no doubt come forward that are going to build on existing relationships or existing activities, which may be able to bring in other contributing partners to increase the total budget. And so us asking this just gives us some sense of overall, what does this look like? We need to be able to manage the budget that we've got. And so that requires us to understand both the total, the spending profile, which really means how does that look like over the time frame? Is it all front-end loaded because it's largely equipment, or is it kind of equal amounts through the years because we have to manage the cash flow that we have? And the use of funds in very kind of high level categories is this largely about capital, operating, or people. And so there's an opportunity to provide a narrative around how those funds are going to be used. And then there's an opportunity to add appendices. There's a couple of mandatory ones around biographies or CVs of both the primary applicant and the organization or the host. But then there's also an opportunity to provide additional material in appendices if you believe or think it would be important to add. And there are no page limits on that particular section, where they do exist on the top. All total, absent the appendices, this will probably round out at about 10 pages in total number of words. Depends on whether you're right up to the word count, but that's approximately the length that you're likely to look at the EOI phase. So now I'm going to give a worked example. So I'm into the second part of the agenda, just checking the time. So I want to use a project. In fact, it's a couple of projects, and I should emphasize this is very much a simplification. And this is not a proposed FRI or an FRI that we just haven't talked about. But this is using a project that we have funded over a number of years as a way to kind of illustrate what we mean by how these things ought to operate. And I've simplified some of the details as well for the purpose of making the example work. And so the purpose of this particular project, and I've not framed these or phrased these as this is what a purpose statement ought to look like. You may want to say, you know, well, the purpose is to do such and such a thing, but information or kind of driving factors that would go into the purpose is this identification, this issue that residents of long-term care facilities, for a variety of different reasons, are at a higher risk of illness. And those facilities have had unacceptably high mortality from respiratory illnesses, not just SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, but also RSV, influenza, and various others. And that a significant and increasing portion of residents in those facilities have dementia or other conditions, which mean that infection control can't be executed or can't be implemented in the way that might be appropriate or available in other areas. So you can start to see how you could frame a purpose commentary or a set of purpose statements around those different dimensions. Using the outcomes framework in our strategy, you can see the connection into a couple of obvious different parts, not just prevention, but around disease detection and caring the vulnerable population. In this particular case, those residents of long-term care. The outcomes associated with it is the improved ability to detect respiratory illness. So that's that detection, and then to reduce the infection. And so this in particular, this project in particular, the details don't actually really matter, but it is the installation of a particular wavelength of ultraviolet light to provide ambient air disinfection within the common areas of long-term care facilities. The impacts that this would hope to have is better quality of life should there be an outbreak. If the intervention works, then what might otherwise had to have been implemented to impose infection control, which is confine everyone to quarters, if this allows normal social and physiotherapy and various other rehab activities to occur, then you can actually improve the quality of life. And of course, you can have lower mortality as well. Some of the actual research outputs is developing assessment tools around understanding when infection may be present for people who may not be able to verbalize it in the ordinary way. And of course, statistical models and an assessment of the efficacy of this particular intervention. The reason I put that here is just to draw the distinction between outputs, which are what is produced by the research activities, outcomes leaving to impact, and why you're doing it being the purpose. Next, there are partners involved, both, of course, the long-term care facilities. In fact, there is a partner as well in the industry supplier. The use of funds is broken down into the three categories that we ask for in the EOI. There's capital expenditures around the actual equipment. There are research nurses at all three facilities and a variety of other personnel attached to this particular set of projects. And there are a range of operating costs, consumables, and so on. And the project and the funding that we've provided is flowing to all three of those different areas. The priority and need, that other aspect of to what end? Well, in Nova Scotia, we have an aging population and increasing percentage of that population needing dementia care. And so while there are, of course, lots of challenges in Nova Scotia, there's lots of challenges with an aging population, that it is a growing population, that we have this challenge with dementia puts a fine focus on why this kind of work might really be helpful. And to that point about the provincial need, Nova Scotia both provides and we regulate long-term care facilities. This is our responsibility. And so honing in on something that the province needs to do and needs to do better is something that makes this quite an interesting area. So the end user is long-term care facilities, but also potentially other facilities with large groups. If this indeed provides an effective ambient air disinfection mechanism, even those outside of long-term care facilities, this could have application in other situations. The beneficiaries, which may be different from the end users, the end user may be a clinician or a facility. The beneficiaries are actually the residents, but also the staff, families, caregivers, and the healthcare system. So I'm using that because in the guidelines, I'm drawing a distinction between end user and beneficiary. Sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're different. But the beneficiary here also is the supplier. We may well, if this demonstrates a capacity to improve some, or to realize some of those impacts described in the previous slide, that actually has a benefit to a commercial opportunity as well, which, pardon me, accrues to the UV supplier. The pathway to impact. So I spent a little bit of time explaining this before, but this project is not just looking at the efficacy of a particular intervention, but from the beginning, it was designed also to understand, would that intervention be acceptable to residents, staff, families, caregivers, those institutions? Is it feasible? We have a built environment. We are not going to overnight change the configuration of long-term care facilities that we have. So can you actually mount this kind of intervention in the facilities that we have? Can we do it in an affordable way? Can we manage those incidental risks, perhaps exposure to eyes and skin of that particular population? So there are elements of this proposal or these sets of projects that are addressing all of those different 5 components that, when taken together, maximize the chance of impact. Because it's not just it works, but you've looked at the other dimensions that are relevant to choices around the actual application of an intervention that is efficacious. And so this is what we mean by the pathway to impact. This is not we will have impact because we will tell people about something. It is that we have thought about how you put together a comprehensive approach that addresses those key areas. Another kind of component to it is that there's been engagement with the end users and the beneficiaries so that we are working with the management of the facilities, staff, residents, families, and caregivers. So those all are things that go in to maximize the chance of impact. And there is ongoing scientific oversight in that there are periodic meetings on the science side to make adjustments, or the ultimately, project gets going, and of course then reality sets in and choices have to be made around, sample design or technological development, and this kind of ongoing oversight provides that kind of support through the project. The other thing I wanted to pause on this is this clearly demonstrates that this is broader than just a kind of health sciences or biomedical. This is as much about social sciences and psychology and social psychology as anything else. So this is not asking a biomedical engineer to become a sociologist, but what this is asking the biomedical engineer to do is to recognize and value the contribution of the psychologist or the sociologist or whoever it might be, and vice versa. And so that's that concept of an integrated approach as a core component to improving that pathway to impact, is taking into account those necessary or supportive different groups of knowledge areas that are required to actually make the outcome overall more achievable. So to what end? How can you, I think you can answer all these different from what I've just described here. You can answer questions around the purpose, the outcome, and the impact, the priority need. I talked a lot about pathway to impact. It's clear what steps were taken to pursue the benefit, working with the partners and collaborators, understanding what the salient issues are. It is very much a research project. It has all those different characteristics within it. It is outcomes driven by research, in that we genuinely don't know whether this will work. And so research is a critical component to understanding if that particular outcome is achievable. It is not one of policy. It is not one of execution. Although those challenges may come, it is very much a research challenge. And it is public research, in that the outcomes are defined outside the research sector. The research that's being done is being driven by the need to solve for those outcomes or pursue those outcomes. It does create knowledge that's applicable elsewhere. And I don't just mean, can you install these lights in, say, a school, but the knowledge that's being generated around how the research participants engage with the residents in a way that allows them to explore what the fears and risks are. That actually has application if we're smart enough to capture that can be applied elsewhere as well. All activities that are being done by these projects is to serve the outcome, every one of them. And the value increases the more results are shared, and that we want everyone to know about this. But the kicker is, it still might not work. And when I say it might not work, what I mean is that the UV lights as installed may not actually reduce the transmission of infectious airborne disease or reduce the mortality rate within those long-term care facilities. So this is not discovery on demand. The FRI model does not assume that you can actually be held to account to achieve that outcome. What we want to hold us all collectively to account to of designing a large, comprehensive, difficult, multidisciplinary set of research projects that have looked after all those different areas that I've just spent the last 10 or 15 minutes talking about in service of achieving those outcomes. Because if we do that well, then we have maximized the chance of providing that contribution. But we recognize this is still an uncertain activity. That's what makes it research. And so we know that it might not work. But if done in this way, there are all kinds of things that we will have learned which will have value. So there's a difference between whether the intervention works and whether we're able to extract value in perhaps this set of circumstances or somewhere else, which still makes this effort worth pursuing. So finally, on the agenda for this morning, and I should also say, I see there's already 10 questions up in the Q&A section. Keep adding them in. We'll go to that as soon as I've done finish this presentation. So where to find information or updates? I already gave you the web link. It's repeated there up at the top, researchns.ca/FRI. And when you open that page, you will see something that looks very much like this. And if you click on expression of interest, that's where I've drawn much of the material for the past half hour or so. But I want to draw your attention to something that's in the guidelines itself, is that we do know that there are going to be things that we wrote in a certain way that we believe or will be interpreted in the way that we intended. But if it is ambiguous, or if there are things that we need to fix, then we will update, and we want to make sure that there's a mechanism to be clear about what those updates or corrections are, and that there is the second component of that you can actually register your email to get notifications of when FAQs are added or where there's corrections or updates. And so it's just a simple form of put your name, your email, so we can contact you, your organization, and then you will be added to the list that whenever there's a change, to receive updates, FAQs, and corrections, we will be sure to alert you so that you're always working with the most recent version. And on what we have online will clearly indicate where those changes or clarifications have been made. Next, if you go to the frequently asked questions, I referred to that just a moment ago. We added the first 6 or 8 or whatever's on the list there just yesterday. We will update these periodically. That will initiate an email out to that distribution list. So where there are questions that come up commonly, we will put them up on the website under the FAQ page. If there are questions in the Q&A section of this webinar that we just don't get time to answer, then it may well appear on the FAQ if it's something that is of broader interest, as opposed to something more specific to an individual's proposed field of work. So just wanted to highlight that it will be updated as required. So then if you go to webinars, well, we're on one right now. So we're at the one at the top, March 7th. But just want to highlight, Megan will be delivering on the 19th of March how you use our grant management system, which is called Jura. And so that's if you haven't registered or you need to take, work through that so that there's no kind of logistical impediments to completing this work on time. Megan will take you through that on the 19th. All of these are recorded, and once they're recorded and saved, then we will post them here. So it says coming soon because this is the first one. Once this has concluded, we will post this webinar right there on the past webinars component. Next, there is a button called Resources, and if you click on that, you'll see a couple of different links. They link both to PDFs. This is a one-page kind of high-level overview from the Nova Scotia Office of Priorities and Planning, which is a kind of a central organ of government, which really keeps their line of sight across the broad strategy and priorities of the government, which kind of cuts across all departments. And so they've been kind enough to provide us with what amounts to an overview of the broader Government of Nova Scotia business plan. And if you are interested in looking at how what you may be proposing links to things that may be of more kind of immediate interest to what the government's thinking of, these two documents can provide really helpful insight into where that thinking is. And so it can help you draw those connections to answer that question to what end, or answer that question multiple ways. And then also, shameless plug here for our podcast. We actually have two podcasts. That's Melissa Flagg and that's me. There's both a video and an audio version. This was released yesterday, and this is about a 40-minute conversation around FRI. And it is the companion piece to a podcast that we released last week, which was outside of what we're doing within FRI, some of the issues or the context of how the research system operates, and some of those matters which we want to use FRIs to address. Now, you've heard me mention Melissa's name a couple of times, so she's the one who developed that from prestige to profit framework, which we've then expanded into a slightly more complicated one, or perhaps more nuanced one. She wrote a couple of articles in Nature and Issues in Science and Technology, and does a lot of thinking in the space. And so she's a great person to have a conversation about this. And she's also on our external advisory panel. You'll see a link to her, as well as the other three panelists on our website as well. The other, I'll just mention Fatnal Shazay, who's one of our panelists as well. She's the Chief Creative Officer of We Us Them in Halifax, and the former chair of the Chamber of Commerce. And then we have Alain Vezina, who's the former Regional Director of Science for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And finally, we have Jennifer Church, who is the Deputy Minister of Priorities and Planning as well. So those are the four that comprise the external advisory. So for any support that you need, and I think this is the last or second to last slide, for any technical issues, that would be anything to do with your application, accessing the system, then that's helpdesk@researchns.ca. I can assure you both of these emails are monitored on an ongoing basis. So if you have a technical issue, use the first one. All other inquiries go to that info@researchns.ca. We are hoping that through the provision of a comprehensive package of information that is in everything from a press release to a one-page summary to an infographic to, of course, the application guidelines. There is a background paper as well, which came out of the consultation paper. There's the FAQs that should cover off much of those inquiries, but we know that individual circumstances, individual questions will still come to the fore. And so we're providing you with a pathway to have those responded to. And as appropriate, we will either complement our FAQ questions and answers, or we'll just respond directly depending on the nature of the question. So a couple of closing thoughts. These aren't really a summary, but just things to highlight. As I mentioned, there is under a tab in the FRI website, there's something called the position paper. You may have read the consultation paper, which was released around mid-January. That, as a result of that consultation, has now become a position paper, and that provides some broader background of what we're trying to achieve. And so is a bit of a companion piece to the application guidelines, which is more of a guide on how to take you through the application process for the EOI phase. Just want to highlight a couple other things. A 5 million FRI is not a junior version of a 20 million FRI. And I don't mean to be cute about this, but I really want to emphasize that we are looking for the right size funding for the right size ideas. And some of them are going to be more costly and some are going to be less costly, depending on the kinds of expenditures that are required, the nature of the discipline, and so on. We're looking for fantastic projects, and we're not necessarily looking to target only big ones or only small ones. And so there, in the discussion phase, in that consultation period, there was some questions about kind of what are you really looking for, and are you looking more towards the big ones because those will be the headlines, and then the development or the B team will be the 5 million. It really doesn't work that way. We genuinely want to find things that are at the right size. There may well be opportunities for other funding options, and this is to encourage you to keep pursuing this line of, or this approach, or this line of thinking, that even if at the EOI stage it's not selected to go through to full proposal, there may be other options, either with Research Nova Scotia or with our work with other organizations, and as well at the final proposal stage. If a proposal is not selected for funding, again, there may be other funding options. Perhaps there's some work that needs to be done to further develop it. We dearly hope to be able to offer this kind of thing in future years. There's a lot of, we should see if one works first before we decide to go again, but there's also some funding challenges that we'll need to work through. But we want to see this as a great way to not necessarily start, because a lot of the conversations have already started, but to continue and enrich conversations and relationships that are already going, because there will be other ways that will pay dividends, either with us or with other organizations. And next, I want to acknowledge this is an accelerated time frame. Those of us here at Research Nova Scotia have been involved in lots of different RFPs, EOIs, full proposals, and this is aggressive. We know that there's a reason why we want to move quickly. We want to demonstrate the value of research in service of society. We want to be able to show those that make funding decisions around research in this province that there is lots of good stuff that can be done. We want them to care and be interested in the outputs of that research. And so there's a reason to have that accelerated time frame. I already mentioned the scientific merit review, but I know that is an important component, and I just want to highlight that again, that is an integral assessment component of this. And again, to emphasize that we will be working alongside those successful EOIs or those selected EOIs to move into the full proposal phase. And again, corrections and clarifications may come, and we will clearly note them. So I will stop there. I know this has been quite a long hour with lots of information. Perhaps some of it was repetitive of things that you've already read, but we really wanted to use this time to establish a clear baseline and provide some additional context to what words are just available on the page, to really give an indication of what it is we're aiming for, because we think that will help you think through what ambition you wish to have and how you want to position the EOI that you will put together. This is a bit of a pitch. I think there's gonna be a lot of interest in this. We've talked to a lot of researchers and research teams and research organizations that are likely to be interested in submitting an EOI, and so we want to help this community develop ideas in a really compelling way, and I hope you have found this useful. So we have approximately half an hour set aside for questions and answers. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A, and by all means, pop them in there, and I'll do what I can to get to as many as possible. Okay, so I'm not sure how to best to do this. So the Steph, can you give me an indication of whether everyone is able to see the questions, or are those just, should I read the questions, or are they available to everyone?
I think only you can see the questions.
Okay, all right. In that case, I'll read the questions. So is there a limit to the number of EOIs will be invited to a full submission? Not a hard limit at this stage. We will select those that we believe have the chance to go to a competitive full proposal, but we're not capping it artificially at a particular number. We want them, we don't want to waste your time, and we don't want you to waste our time if it's not ready, or if there is reason, we will it is adjudicative and we will take them out, but we're not aiming for a particular number. FRI will it be a recurring opportunity over the next few years? Boy, I sure hope so. But that requires this effort to work, first of all, and it requires the sort of funding levels that we require, which is always an active discussion. Can there be two PIs on a project? Yes, there can be. If you go into the Jura system, there is a mechanism to add two primary applicants or multiple primary applicants, but then of course you can also describe additional participants in the team page where you can describe who else will be participating. There's a question around measuring transferability, otherwise known sometimes as generalizability. Will applicants be able to make the case for the version of generalizability that applies to their research? I am concerned primarily about the bias against case studies. The answer is yes, it is that the researchers can make the case for generalizability. Yes, it makes, it will be different by discipline, by subject area. Equally, there may be some concern when we use words like broad applicability. That doesn't mean all 1 million Nova Scotians have to directly benefit from this. It can be a much smaller group, but there has to be a broader social interest in providing that outcome or having that impact on that group. But it is up to the applicants to make a convincing case of the transferability or applicability or generalizability of that work to other areas. Are we able to collaborate with organizations, university nonprofits outside the province? Yes, absolutely. We're expecting these to be Nova Scotia-based organizations, but consistent with the idea that we are most interested in pursuing outcomes of value to the province, we want to, as a measure of providing both accountability and control to the recipients, to identify who needs to participate in order to achieve that. And they can certainly be outside of the province as required. There's a question around speaking about the highest scientific standards and the distinction between end users and the study of specific at-risk Nova Scotian populations as part of the research. I think I'm going to have to read that question and get back to the actual applicant or the actual question, because I need to spend some time thinking about that one. Steph, can we just make sure we save that, and I will address that and put into FAQs as required. Can you clarify who the host would be in this example? The host in this example. If the question was around the example that I used, the host in that particular case was Nova Scotia Health. But the host could have been outside of Nova Scotia Health as long as the arrangements were made to be able to provide the equipment, access to people, and so on that would allow the pursuit and achievement of the research objectives. I hope that was what you meant by the question. If not, send in a message to the info@researchns and we'll address it in the way that you intended. There's a question, there's a lot of discussion of scientific research. What about pure social sciences research and or participatory community-led based research? Will these also be considered? Yes, I think the opportunity certainly exists to make a convincing case around a contribution that social sciences and community-led and community-based research can make. that matches all of those criteria and decision-making elements that I've described there. I think it would be unfortunate if this was interpreted as really something about health systems, STEM research, and engineering. I think that the idea here is we need the disciplines that are required to be involved to achieve the outcome. And if that includes the social sciences, or even exclusively the social sciences, then that is absolutely fair game in an FRI. Moving quickly through them just in the interest of time to try and get through as many questions as possible. We've got a question: was the option to fund a fixed number of projects at a maximum level of a certain number of dollars considered? The current structure has me thinking about how to budget strategically, thinking about competing with the other big projects approaching 20 million versus those applying at a more modest, relatively speaking, 8 million. Well, yes and no. Certainly did consider establishing a fixed number of 2 or 3 at a certain level, but given the desire to allow projects to tailor the expenses associated with developing research outputs to the complexity of the outcomes and the disciplines that it would require and the cost structures associated with it, that was what led to providing a range. Now, within the overall envelope of 25 million that we have secured at this point, the math is relatively simple. It could be one at 20 million and one at 5 million if we really are kept to 25 million in total. So that would be 2. It will not allow for more than 2 if one at the full 20 million is adopted. So we're going to have some difficult choices to make, but also I think a challenge for us is where there are proposed FRI that for whatever reason don't fit within the funding envelope that we can pull together. Part of what we want to be able to do is advocate on behalf of the value that that project would bring, because at that stage we'll have a pretty comprehensive list of what the costs and the benefits are and who the intended beneficiaries might be. And that will allow us to identify potential other funding sources that may be in the province, maybe outside the province. They may be philanthropic organizations or charitable organizations. It may be government agencies. So I want to be clear on how much funding that we have secured at this point, so I don't imply that there is more money than is available that we have within our control, but at the same time give this sense that we're trying to make this kind of thinking and this kind of model of pursuing research of interest to lots of others, and in so doing, perhaps find a way to increase the level of participation at the funding level to allow more of this work to happen. So I hope that answered your question, and if I didn't, please feel free to send an email in and I'll do a better job of it. When should we generally expect the EOI results? We need to get this done relatively early in May. So the deadline is the 29th of April. We have an external panel being scheduled in early May, depending on how much follow-up. I don't want to commit to a fixed date because we want to see how many there are, how complicated they are, if there's any follow-up. But urgency on our part in moving through those with great speed is certainly weighing on us heavily, because we want to get those teams working on the full proposals with as much time to work on those as possible. But I would expect mid-May as our target. Next question is, what are the expected contents of the host profile PDF? So that is a question about one of the appendices. The first appendix would be a CV or a CCV if you have one, or a profile of the researcher. The host profile is simply a description of who that host is if it's not obviously known. Now, you should put in a profile, but it could be simply a link to a web page that describes who it is. Now, if it comes in from a university, that's not going to be hard for us to determine, but these are open to other organizations outside the post-secondary sector. And so if there are proposed hosts that are outside of that more perhaps traditional group, then we just want to make sure we know who we're dealing with. And so this is the opportunity to provide a succinct description of who those hosts are. And then the other element to that is it is an external advisory panel, one of whom doesn't live in this province. And so this is also a way to provide a quick snapshot of that organization and what it looks like. If you're proposing to set up a new host, then and it doesn't yet exist, that is available as an option under the FRI model. And so in such a case, then there would be no host profile in the appendix section. If hopefully I answered that question to your satisfaction. Next question is around if the research is focused in Nova Scotia, is it possible for one or some of the researchers based in the province? I handled that, and the answer is yes, for sure. Can you speak to any relative scoring between the categories? For example, having the right people involved versus having a large pre-existing budget, or will the adjudication of EOIs be more holistic? It will be more holistic. We've not developed, as we have in some of the previous kind of funding opportunities that Research Nova Scotia has done, with a fully elaborated scoring rubric with percentages across the different dimensions, in favor of a more holistic view, just as you've suggested there. I do have to say that we've certainly given some thought of how this is going to work, but as the panel again meets, I think we've got our next meeting scheduled before the EOIs conclude. That will also be a topic of conversation with the panel to work through with them the best mechanism to assess them. The next question, some of these big efforts and solutions may require building of teams. Would you see this team building phase being an acceptable part of the proposed project? I think it matters quite a lot about what you mean precisely by team building phase. We are an organization that is able to support research activities, and of course recognize that part of that is building the team, but it would be different if the first kind of year of activity would be to go and find ways to identify the right people, bring them together to build towards a research, essentially to the delivery of the FRI. If that was kind of more the model, then it would be the sort of thing where you might want to use this as an opportunity to hone the thinking and take the time in the hopes that we're able to offer this in future years with another opportunity. If, however, what you mean team building, that there are elements of needing to organize, kind of clarify those elements, then that I would see as being part of the research process. It's not a bright line of where one ends and one begins, but really the emphasis is on the pursuit of research outputs in service of that outcome. And that's where the majority of the funding and effort needs to go, rather than building up the elements to begin with. It's going to be a little perhaps not different, but more flexibility depending on the degree of integration with different types of communities or end user groups. And that may form part more of a proposed project because it's actually a part of a research activity to be engaging with that particular community or set of communities. So the details really do matter. And I hope I've answered your question adequately there. A question, who can we speak to for clarification on the provincial priorities and planning document to discuss alignment of a project with government priorities? So in the first instance, once you've had a chance to review that one-page summary and the government business plan, I wouldn't necessarily be limited to that. There's also individual government department business plans that they've submitted as part of the budget process, and then mandate letters for individual ministers. And so without knowing what your particular field is or what FRI you might be building, if it fits quite nicely within Department of Community Services or Agriculture, because it's really focused on government policy or government service delivery, there are other opportunities to get more detailed information that's descending to a level that's more relevant to your specific project. If after that there's clarification required, I just encourage you to send in an email to info, and we'll try and facilitate that discussion with the appropriate people, because we do provide a bit of a connection in to the provincial level, even though we're not actually part of the provincial system. We're funded by the province, but we're funded by them to support the research system. A question, this is a comment to be shared with the webinar participants. Oh, good, because I'm about to read it. Writing on behalf of the McKechnie Institute for Public Policy and Governance at Dalhousie. We're interested in collaborating with researchers who are interested in putting forward an EOI. The McKechnie Institute will not lead an application, but we can bring policy expertise and awareness to the co-creation of applications and project execution as we are built into the proposal. Please reach out if you're interested, and the email is Jocelyn with an E at the end, .rankin@dal.ca. So I know that wasn't a question, that was a comment, and I'm happy to share that with everyone on this call. If you didn't get that email, just go to the recording at the appropriate about an hour and 20 in, and you can get it. We, in the EOI phase, we're not offering kind of a clearinghouse or kind of communications opportunity. That's just more than we're able to contribute at this point, in the hopes that through existing networks that you all have, you have the ability to find potential partners and collaborators. Once we depart from the EOI phase, once EOIs have been selected to move to full proposal, then we will be making information broadly available on what EOIs are being developed, because we do see ongoing development occurring in the transition from an EOI to a proposed and to the full proposal. A question, would you please elaborate what host is in the proposal? So host is defined in the application guidelines as the organizational structure that is managing the FRI. So it is the location where the FRI is held. And if after reviewing the definition in the application guidelines, there remains ambiguity in your mind, please send a note. And if we need broader clarification, we'll add that to the FAQs. We've got about 8 minutes left. I'm going to blow through as many of these as I can. What are the limitations around capital expenditures associated with the projects? There's no fixed limit around that. Although I think sort of in the context of this being a bit of a pitch, and knowing that there are going to be lots of other projects, that should serve to provide an indication of where that ambition should be. If it's only around capital or extensive or almost exclusively around capital, with then opening the door to apply for other funds to actually operate or use that capital, that is not going to be an attractive prospect. If you need capital in order to do the work, then absolutely capital expenditures can form a very prominent or extensive component of the overall research budget. But we're not capping it, because the kinds of capital required to achieve the outcomes may be very little to non-existent to quite high. And so imposing an artificial cap, we did not see as appropriate at this time. If you have specific questions, then you can send in an email to info@. Next question, do you expect or prefer applications with large matching funds or in-kind contributions sufficient? It really is driven by the need to achieve that outcome. Of course, there is a value to having partners who are interested and willing to contribute, partly because it magnifies the value of our resources, but also because it's an indication of the value of that outcome to other organizations. A couple other comments. We did not want to put in a fixed level like CFI uses commonly 40 or 60, because then applications, frankly, are tailored to match those particular numbers. So we're making it a little bit easier in some ways and a little bit harder by not putting in a fixed amount. And the second is that legitimate in-kind contributions, so where the contribution of data or expertise or facilities by a partner is really important to the delivery of the research outputs in service of those outcomes, those are incredibly valuable. And I know that in some competitions, there may be some may look in askance at in-kind and how they're valued, but it really depends on the integrity of that in-kind And if it really does matter for the delivery of the project, that's just as good as cash. And in some respects, maybe even more valuable in some respects. If you have more specific questions, please send in a note. Next question, you indicated that additional information may be requested to support the EOI. Can you provide details on what this might include and the timelines to respond? I wish I could answer that. It kind of depends on how people, like what kind of response comes in, but it could be simple clarifications. We don't understand something, or it could be taken in two different ways. And so it could be a relatively simple clarification. It could be something that if it's cutting across all, perhaps we want to seek out a more comprehensive understanding of, for instance, what's being proposed to address equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. That could be an example. The timelines will be, I will say, relatively short, given the need to respond to or select the EOIs to move to full proposal. We are not going to be asking for a whole bunch of new essay questions. It might actually even be a phone conversation or a simple response to a set of written questions. We're really going to tailor those to specifically what we think would be best served to help us make good choices, and rather than just adding on a bunch of information for the sake of it. The next question is it permissible to budget for a contract research organization, a CRO, to conduct research I think it's components of projects? Are principal applicants from outside Nova Scotia who address Nova Scotia issues eligible to apply? Well, the second part's been answered. So yes, there is the opportunity where contracted research organizations is the most efficient way to deliver a service. So we have funded projects where samples are sent out of province because there is a lab that is best suited, has the equipment on a fee-for-service basis. There's no fixed kind of limit to how that might be. I think generally speaking, as an efficiency measure where that's essential to achieve the objectives, that's great. But if that is increasing, if that's a substantial portion, then we're going to have some questions about whether this is really the right vehicle, whether FRI is the right vehicle for this particular proposal. Next question, since the pot of funds is limited to possibly only 2 applications, and some of us may be working on similar projects ideas, will there be any opportunity to connect with other applicants and combine efforts to develop more robust teams? The answer to that is quite possibly yes. It depends a bit on what we see coming in the EOI. We don't have an intention necessarily of playing matchmaker or trying to force things together. We may open that discussion option, but ultimately we can open the door, but it's up to the research community to decide whether that really makes sense to walk through it. So we're going to have to, I'm sorry to say, remain slightly ambiguous on this particular point, except to observe that in particular, when there may be EOI teams that are not aware, at least fully aware of the details, that once those EOIs become known, and in the first instance, just known to us, we may, as part of that questioning back to the teams, begin to probe whether merging or combining might be an appropriate response given the particular set of issues, or if there's alignment with those particular outcomes. And that might be merged because they're addressing the same sort of thing, or within the same outcome area, there's a set of research projects managed by separate teams, but it would actually do well to come together within a single integrated FRI. Next question, will academic institutions receive indirect costs to host an FRI? Is the proposed host institution eligible for indirect costs if they're not an academic institution? So the FRI model doesn't provide indirect costs. If costs are attributable to the delivery of the FRI, including things that might otherwise in other programs be considered or diffused into indirect costs, but if they can be attributed to the project, then we consider those to be eligible expenses. There is some commentary within the position paper that I'd encourage you to read. I don't want to hunt around for the project, but where the host is outside an academic institution, there is some commentary around some of those costs. But in general, consistent with our flexibility to use the Research Opportunities Fund that we have from the province, it is to fund research projects, not research organizations. And that applies to us as much as it is to the funds that we grant outwards. Next question, are there any priority areas? For example, is there a preference for projects that focus on health-related issues? No. Very deliberately, we have left this open. I would look at the research strategy that we have and the outcomes framework that we've got, and we are very much interested in proposals that explore areas at any part of that. Again, if we are able to continue this as a model going forward, that will allow us to round out or become more comprehensive in the areas that we address. But in the first instance, we are equally open to all different areas. Will applicants receive feedback on their EOI? Yes, they will. Could you please clarify the eligibility criteria? FRI recipients must, 1, be or become a legal entity with authority over resources, and 2, does FRI recipients, yes, mean the host institution organization? Yes, that's exactly what it means. So the host is the structure that is receiving and administering the activities. And that's the entity that needs to administer, receive, report on, hold to account, manage the funds. If in my rush, I'm going to answer one more question. If my rush to answer that wasn't enough, please send in a further email. We're 2 minutes over, so I'm going to crash through one more question. You had mentioned that this is not meant for training programs, but could a training component for end users be an acceptable activity if it feeds into the larger project objectives and there are other activities? So if it's strictly speaking a training activity, then that's beyond what an FRI can do. If it is the end point of the research activity and it is a kind of a completion of those research outputs to position it to have that, to realize that outcome, then you could make the argument, but that may be an area in the negotiation phase or the discussion phase that a proposed recipient would have to find ways to kind of ensure that it is consistent with the intention and the limitations that we have on the use of funds from which this program is being supported. So I know there are still a couple other questions, but I'm about to lose my voice and we're over time. So I'm going to thank everyone. I genuinely tried to get through as many as possible. I hope this was helpful, both the presentation that I gave and that in the questions that you've learned. Do attend Megan's webinar later in the month for some of the details, and don't hesitate to get in touch by email if you have any further questions. So with that, I'll say thank you very much to everyone and wish you the best in developing your proposals. And we hope to see lots of great applications. Thank you.